Hi, this is Nathaniel Jones, Anthropology 1000, summer semester of 2022. We are going to be talking about Mormonism's basis claims of the history of the Americas and what the implications of our anthropological findings mean for the state of Utah, its culture, and laws. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to have to go through this really fast because there's a lot of material here, so I'll try my best. I'm also going to assume that you know a decent amount about Mormons and the Book of Mormon. Specifically, we're going to be using their literature, the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price. And also, I'll be citing from a podcast from Dr. Coe, who is a renowned Mayan anthropologist. So those are my sources. So in the Book of Mormon, the reason we're using Pearl of Great Price and Book of Mormon is because those two pieces of literature specifically claim to be a historical, factual record of the Mesoamerican people, and specifically during the Mayan period. It does go into bleed into some other periods a little bit, but that for the most part, it's the Mayans. So I'm going to have to go through this really fast. These are the things that you can find that the Book of Mormon claims should have happened in the Americas during this time frame that we talked about. Such things as use of copper, complex monetary system. They spoke Reformed Egyptian, Jesus visiting the Americas, use of crops that we didn't find until after the Spanish invasion. All right, so let's go ahead and get through this. All right, so the Book of Mormon claims that there were horses, elephants, cattle, pigs, chickens, Hurlams, and Kumans, whatever those are, in the Americas during this time period. But anthropologically, we know that horses evolved in the Americas, migrated to Asia, and became extinct around 700 BC due to overhunting. They were reintroduced when the Spaniards arrived. The only elephant to ever exist in the Americas during this time was a woolly mammoth, and they went extinct around 2000 BC. Cattle and pigs not brought into the Americas until the Spaniards brought them. And then this is really interesting. Chicken bones found in Chile around 1200 AD were actually of Polynesian descent. Now, the Book of Mormon claims that everything should have come from the Middle East, but what we find is the chicken bones that we do find in this area during this time period were actually Polynesian descent. Lineage, okay, so the Book of Mormon claims the Mesoamericans are direct descendants of Israel. And specifically two groups, the Jaredites that lived during 900 BC and the Nephites and Lamanites between 590 to 480. Then this was a big deal to Mormons. I remember it happened when I was a kid. They finally were able to sequence DNA, and the Mormons thought that the result of this test was going to prove that Native Americans are descendants of Israel. But the actual real result came back that they were of Asian descent. And once this happened, it was very disappointing. So they started shifting the goalposts and claiming, well, there might have been other groups of people that might have come from Asia or whatever and mixed with the Nephites and Lamanites. But despite that ever even have occurring, you still should have found microcaudal DNA of Israel origin. There is none. Also, there is no record of white people ever existing in Mesoamerica. The Book of Mormon claims that this group of people, Nephites, were white. The other group, the Lamanites, were brown because God cursed them with a dark skin for being wicked. So, the Nephites in the Book of Mormon use steel tools and iron tools, coins of various metals, and metallic plates. And we know that copper existed. Copper didn't exist before 800 AD when the Aztecs actually started using it. Brass helmets did not exist. The only usage of helmets by Mesoamericans is in a game called Poctopoc, and it's just recreational. It wasn't for warfare. Use of iron and steel arrows, but Mesoamericans used stone-tipped arrows and would even travel very long distances to obtain obsidian to make them. Chariots never used by Native Americans. In fact, when the Spaniards came to the Mayans, they fought them on foot, and they did not ever use chariots. Very limited use of wheels. Almost everything the Mayans did, they transported it on their backs. These supposed Nephites used a complex monetary system, but none existed in the Mayan culture. They actually traded with cocoa beans. No use of metallic armors. Mayans never used gold, and it only appeared from the Aztecs. The Aztecs were kind of, the metallurgists of the Mesoamericans, and they existed after the time period of the Book of Mormon. And no coin has ever been found before the time of Spain's invasion. And you would expect to see that with a population of millions of people. We find coins over in Europe and other areas all the time, and no coin has ever been found. This is a big one. The Book of Mormon claims massive wars occurred in the Mayan time period. And then when I say massive, I'm talking millions of people on the scale of World War II. But we don't find any of that, any evidence of that in archaeological dig sites or anything, which would be very, very easy to find. We're talking millions of people. It would be massive graves of people full of armor and swords and all kinds of things. It's never been found. Also, there was never a Mayan empire, but some small city-states did exist, and we know at the height of the Mayan population was about a few million. Also, it's the time frame that the Book of Mormon gives us, roughly 1,000-year history. They claim that a single family of maybe a handful of people, 20 at the most, grew to the size of millions, several millions of people in only 1,000 years, and had wars, several wars of millions of people dying. It's simply, the math doesn't add up. It's not possible that this happened. It takes a lot longer than that for the population to recover. Also, the Mayans never used a 7-day calendar like the Book of Mormon infers. They actually used a 13-day calendar, which was completely different. Nephites used a language called Reformed Egyptian. We know that this is not true. The Mayans they spoke Mayan, and all 29 Mayan languages come from a single language called Chultani. There is zero Egyptian or any derivative of it can be found in the Mayan language. Mayan writing actually appears around 200 AD, and this would be hundreds of years already into the story of the Book of Mormon. The Israelites already had a written language long before Lehi's family. And remember, Lehi is the first guy that came to America, right, according to the Book of Mormon. So if he came from there, he should have brought his writing and his language with him, but you just don't see it. The Olmec people, which was it's real, around the time of the Jaredites, had almost no writing, and the one tablet that was found from them can't be translated. And then Mormons love to use this as an example of how the Book of Mormon can't be fake. There's a writing style called chiasmus, which is a type of poetry found in the Bible. Is also found in the Book of Mormon. So they say, well, there's proof right there that they use the same writing style. How could they have known that? But what we find in reality is that this writing style, which is a form of poetry, can be found all over the world. It's not unique. Among other things, I got to get through this. I'm already almost at 10 minutes. Plants and horticulture. Okay, cultivation of corn happened strictly in Mesoamerica. It would have taken thousands of years to cultivate the corn, which doesn't match the time frame of when Lehi and his family came from Israel. They simply wouldn't have had enough time to cultivate corn in that time period. Wheat never existed in Mesoamerica, and it must pollinate to exist. Same thing with rye and barley. They have to make pollen, and you can take corn samples and you will find evidence of this pollen in places that it did exist. But corn samples have been taken from the Americas during this time period, and there is no evidence of any pollen. And these plants were brought by the Spaniards. After the Spaniards came, you can find evidence in the coin samples. And then also plants domesticated in Mesoamerica began cultivation around the same time frame as the Old World, meaning the technology didn't come from the Old World. It, in fact, simultaneously happened in the Americas at the same time. All right, this is an interesting one. So the Book of Mormon claims Jesus came to the Americas after his death in the Bible. And they say it's this guy named, I'm going to slaughter this, Quetzalcoatl. They believe that this guy was some white god that came and visited the Mayans, and this Quetzalcoatl was actually Jesus. What we know is actually the real story of Quetzalcoatl was manipulated by the Spaniards as a sort of propaganda. The original story was of a Mayan king called Snake Jaguar. But the story was changed by the Spaniards to this Quetzalcoatl guy who was white like them, right? And it was to justify their invasion of America and make it seem like Cortez was this Quetzalcoatl guy. And it was fulfilling some kind of prophecy. Also, no literature appears anywhere in Mayan history stating Jesus came to the Americas, which you think you would find it, right? Spaniards used propaganda to take credit for the building of temples, saying only the whites are the ones that could have done it because they're the more sophisticated race, right? And the dark-skinned people were savages and primitives, and there's no way that they could have made the temples. So the Spaniards were just sending out all this propaganda to kind of brainwash and change the narrative of Mesoamericans to justify their actions. This is kind of a whole other subject, but this is a different book called the Book of Abraham. We're no longer talking about the Book of Mormon. It's supposed to be a book that Joseph Smith translated from a scroll that was in Egyptian, right? So there's this guy, came to Joseph Smith, gave him a scroll, he looked at it, and he said, this is an ancient scroll about the story of Abraham, right? And the Abraham of the Bible. And this was before the Rosetta Stone was discovered, so no one could translate Egyptian. So it was anyone's guess, right? He claimed that this scroll was, scroll of Abraham's life, but it actually turned out after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone that it was just a common funeral scroll. And it had nothing to do with what Joseph Smith claimed it was, right? Not even sort of. And so, it just kind of highlights that he was full of it. I don't know. But to me, especially, this is a big thing. It's just because he absolutely said it is this. They made an entire book out of it called The Pearl of Great Price. And it actually turns out it's this funeral scroll that had nothing to do with what they were talking about. All right, so I know that was quick. I had to really go over that fast. But what is our conclusion from all this anthropology that we just did, right? There is zero evidence supporting any claims of the Book of Mormon. And even some that are kind of maybe, they're an extreme reach. Almost all Mormon anthropologists have lost their faith, according to Dr. Ko, the podcast I listen to. He's a leading Mayan anthropologist, and he's interacted with a lot of Mormon anthropologists. Zero non-Mormon anthropologists support the historic claims of the Book of Mormon. Over 100 years in digging hundreds of Mesoamerican sites has yielded any evidence whatsoever of Book of Mormon claims. Smith lived in a time when Mesoamerican culture was being discovered. And before 1830, there wasn't, and the Mesoamerican archaeological dig site never even existed. So there was a lot that was unknown at the time, but there was a very popular book at the time of Smith called Incidents of Travel in Yucatan. And Smith had read this book before creating the Book of Mormon. So it kind of gives you an idea of where he might have gotten some of his ideas about ancient America. All Mesoamerican anthropology discoveries contain zero evidence of Semitic culture, but instead reveal a culture that's unique on its own. The question of whether Mormonism is true or not is not a scientific one because it can't be disproven. The same as how you can't prove unicorns do not exist. It's not a science-based question. Any science-based hypothesis has to be able to be disproven. And so it's not a science-based question. But whether the Book of Mormon is true or not, we can conclude from anthropology that it is absolutely not true. Same thing with the Book of Abraham. I think that's quite obvious. So what does this mean for Utah? Well, and that's the point of all this, right? So Utah has this mega corporation that calls itself a church. It heavily affects our laws, our culture, and even the real estate market here, businesses, everything. There was a law against fornication that only recently got removed in 2018, and very reluctantly so by the government here. The Mormon church's effect on the control of real estate. So I know this personally, since my family deals in real estate. We see the Mormon church's hand in everything up and down the Wasatch Front. And then the tax-free status of a 200 billion plus mega corporation. And that's a very rough number, but it's probably on the low side. This is because the church is very secretive about their finances. But we do know that it is a mega corporation and they do have tax-free status. Their manipulation of laws such as Proposition 8, marijuana legalization, abortion laws, and alcohol laws in Utah. The separation of church and state. When does a church stop being a church and becomes a business? Which is a great question for Mormonism. It is actually a corporation. There is a literal corporation for the church. But they still enjoy a tax-free status. So that's lost revenue for the state for taxes that could be going to social programs or other things, even lowering taxes for regular citizens. But this business gets a free pass on taxes. So we shouldn't be basing these sorts of things on a religion, especially a religion that their major books, the Book of Mormon and Book of Abraham, are completely unsupported by anthropological findings. And I just think that it's time that people woke up to this and we stopped believing in fairy tales and letting it affect the way that we run things nowadays in Utah. And that's my presentation. Thank you.